because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. Niccolo Machiavelli. I learned this lesson the hard way during my first management role at a tech startup in Austin back in 2018. I was 29, fresh out of business school, and absolutely convinced that being the nice boss would make me successful. I mean, who doesn't want to be liked, right? I thought kindness was my superpower, my secret weapon that would inspire loyalty and drive results. Boy, was I wrong. My team consisted of 5 developers, and I made it my mission to be their friend first, manager second. When deadlines slipped, I'd say things like, "Hey, no worries, we'll figure it out." When someone showed up late consistently, I'd cover for them in meetings with upper management. I genuinely believed that by being understanding and flexible, I was building trust and creating a positive work environment where everyone would naturally want to excel. The wake-up call came during our Q2 review meeting. My boss, Sarah, a sharp woman in her 40s who'd built 3 successful companies, pulled me aside after our team presentation. "David," she said, looking directly at me, "your team likes you, but they don't respect you. And frankly, neither do I." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but she wasn't finished. Nice managers finish last because they confuse being liked with being effective. That week, I watched our biggest client walk away because we'd missed our 3rd consecutive deadline. The contract was worth $200,000, and suddenly my understanding approach didn't seem so virtuous anymore. I realized that my kindness wasn't protecting my team. It was enabling their mediocrity and ultimately threatening their jobs. Being nice had become a form of negligence. I started researching effective leadership styles and stumbled across Harvard Business Review data showing that highly agreeable leaders are 23% less likely to get promoted and their teams show 18% lower productivity. The numbers didn't lie. My approach was scientifically proven to fail. But why? Because avoiding difficult conversations and tough decisions doesn't make problems disappear. It makes them multiply. The turning point came when I studied historical leaders who'd faced real consequences for their decisions. Take King Louis XVI of France. The man literally lost his head because he was too kind to make the harsh choices necessary to save his kingdom. He wanted to be loved by both the nobility and the common people, so he avoided the difficult reforms that might have prevented the French Revolution. His excessive kindness cost him everything. In the business world, I discovered the story of Blockbuster's leadership team, who were too nice to their existing business model to make the disruptive decisions about streaming. They didn't want to hurt their physical stores or upset their traditional revenue streams. Meanwhile, Netflix destroyed them completely because Netflix leaders were willing to cannibalize their own DVD business to build something better. I realized that modern society had sold me a lie, that kindness alone was a leadership virtue. But kindness without strength is just weakness wearing a disguise. People don't follow weak leaders, they exploit them. And in a world where everyone is fighting for limited resources, promotion opportunities and market share, being nice is often interpreted as being naive. The data was overwhelming. A study of 30,000 executives showed that leaders who were too agreeable consistently underperformed because they avoided necessary conflicts. They didn't fire. Underperformers didn't push back on unrealistic demands and didn't make the tough strategic choices that separate successful organizations from failing ones. Their teams suffered because someone needed to set standards and enforce accountability. That's when I understood Machiavelli's wisdom wasn't about being cruel, it was about being realistic. The world doesn't reward good intentions, it rewards effective actions. Being kind to one person often means being unfair to 10 others. When I let one team member consistently underperform, I was being unkind to the 4 others who had to pick up the slack. I made a decision that night to completely restructure my approach to leadership. Instead of asking, "How can I be nice?" I started asking, "How can I be effective?" Instead of avoiding difficult conversations, I began scheduling them. Instead of covering for people, I started holding them accountable. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was profound. Within 6 months, our team's performance metrics improved by 40%. We stopped missing deadlines, our client satisfaction scores increased, and ironically, team morale was higher than it had ever been under my nice leadership style. People respected clear expectations and consistent accountability more than they appreciated my previous wishy-washy kindness. But here's what really shocked me. Once I established myself as someone with standards, my occasional moments of genuine kindness had 10 times more impact than when kindness was my default mode. When I helped someone through a personal crisis or recognized exceptional work, it meant something because it was earned, not expected. That's when I realized the most powerful leaders aren't the nicest ones. They're the ones who understand exactly when to be kind and when to be firm. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. Da Niccolo Machiavelli. After my awakening about the dangers of being too nice, I became obsessed with studying leaders who seemed to break all the conventional wisdom about kindness and still succeeded wildly. The name that kept coming up was Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. This guy was legendary for what people called constructive paranoia. He'd fire vice presidents in front of entire teams and created Intel's famous culture of only the paranoid survive. Yet somehow he'd saved Intel from bankruptcy multiple times and built it into a semiconductor giant. I remember reading about Grove's approach during a particularly challenging period at my company in early 2019. We'd just hired a new team lead, Marcus, who everyone loved immediately. He was charming, funny, and incredibly agreeable in meetings. But after 3 months, I started noticing a pattern. His projects were consistently delayed, his team seemed confused about priorities, and somehow nothing was ever really his fault. Sound familiar? I was watching my old self in action. The contrast became crystal clear when I compared Marcus to our other team lead, Jennifer. She was what you might call difficult. She asked tough questions in meetings, never let anyone off the hook for missed deadlines, and wasn't afraid to tell senior management when their requests were unrealistic. People complained about her being too intense. But here's the thing. Her team consistently delivered exceptional work. Her developers were getting promoted faster than anyone else's, and clients specifically requested to work with her team. Around this same time, I discovered the cautionary tale of Ron Johnson, who became CEO of JCPenney in 2011. This guy seemed perfect on paper. Former Apple retail genius, MBA from Harvard, universally described as a nice guy who wanted to avoid the mean tactics of traditional retail. He refused to fire underperforming executives because he didn't want to hurt anyone, avoided giving direct feedback to maintain positive team morale, and tried to transform the company through pure enthusiasm and vision. The results were catastrophic. In just 17 months, Johnson nearly bankrupted a century-old company. Sales dropped 40%, the stock price collapsed, and thousands of people lost their jobs, far more than would have been affected by his initial mean decisions to cut dead weight. His kindness to a few executives cost thousands of regular employees their livelihoods. That's when I realized that avoiding tough decisions isn't actually kind. It's selfish cowardice disguised as virtue. I started paying attention to similar patterns everywhere. In my personal life, I had a friend named Tom who was everyone's favorite guy. He never said no to anyone, always picked up the check, never confronted anyone about anything. But you know what I noticed? When Tom needed help moving apartments, somehow only 2 people showed up. When he went through a difficult breakup, people were too busy to support him. Everyone liked Tom, but nobody truly respected him enough to prioritize his needs when it mattered. The workplace dynamics were even more revealing. During team meetings, I watched how people responded differently to Marcus versus Jennifer. When Marcus gave feedback, people would nod politely and then basically ignore his suggestions. They'd make the same mistakes repeatedly because they knew he wouldn't really hold them accountable. But when Jennifer spoke, everyone leaned in. They took notes. They followed through. Why? Because they knew she meant business. This led me to a painful realization about modern leadership culture. We've created this mythology that being collaborative and empathetic automatically makes you effective. LinkedIn is full of posts about servant leadership and leading with heart, But these buzzwords often mask a fundamental misunderstanding about human psychology. People don't follow leaders they can manipulate. They follow leaders they respect. And respect isn't earned through endless accommodation. I decided to test this theory directly. The next time Marcus's team missed a deadline, instead of letting it slide, I scheduled a one-on-one with him and said exactly what Jennifer would have said. This is the third missed deadline this quarter. Your team is affecting everyone else's work. What's your plan to fix this immediately? The conversation was uncomfortable, but something shifted. Marcus started taking ownership instead of making excuses. The breakthrough moment came during our Q3 planning session. Marcus, who had been struggling with authority for months, finally pushed back on an unrealistic deadline from upper management. He said, "Based on our current resources, we can deliver a quality product in 8 weeks, or a rushed product in 6 weeks. Which do you prefer?" The executive team actually respected his honesty and gave him the 8 weeks. His confidence grew exponentially from that single moment of standing firm. By the end of that year, Marcus had transformed into one of our most effective team leads. But here's what really struck me. His team members started describing him as fair and trustworthy, rather than just nice. They appreciated having clear expectations and consistent accountability. The lesson was unmistakable. People don't want bosses who are their friends. They want bosses who help them succeed and grow. But this paradox extended far beyond just workplace dynamics. I started noticing it in negotiations, relationships, even simple daily interactions. The people who commanded genuine respect weren't the ones who always said yes. They were the ones who said no when it mattered, who stood their ground when they believed in something, who were willing to disappoint others in service of larger principles. That's when I realized that what most people call being difficult is actually just being effective. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Niccolo Machiavelli. The first time I truly understood this principle was during a business trip to London in 2020, right before the pandemic hit. I was staying at the Churchill War Rooms, and our tour guide mentioned something that stopped me cold. During Britain's darkest hour, Churchill was called cruel, obstinate, and impossible to work with, even by his own allies. But it was precisely that hardness that kept Britain fighting when everyone else wanted to surrender. I stood there in that underground bunker, imagining Churchill making life-or-death decisions while bombs fell overhead. The guide explained how Churchill's own cabinet members complained about his unreasonable demands, his refusal to consider peace negotiations, his harsh treatment of generals who showed any hint of defeatism. But here's what hit me. If Churchill had been nice in those moments, if he'd been collaborative and accommodating, Hitler would have won. Sometimes being difficult isn't just effective, it's morally necessary. That trip happened right as I was dealing with my own leadership crisis back home. Our startup was bleeding money, and I was facing pressure from investors to make massive layoffs. My natural instinct was to try to save everyone's job, to find some nice solution that wouldn't hurt anyone. But standing in that war room, I realized that trying to avoid short-term pain often creates much greater long-term suffering. When I returned to Austin, I made the hardest decision of my career. I laid off 30% of our team in one day. People called me heartless. Some former employees posted negative reviews about our company culture online. For weeks, I questioned whether I'd become the kind of leader I never wanted to be. But 6 months later, our company not only survived but thrived. The remaining team members got raises, we launched our best product ever, and we ended up hiring back even more people than we'd let go. That's when I started studying other leaders who'd made similar cruel decisions that ultimately saved more jobs and created more value. Reed Hastings at Netflix became my obsession. This guy built a culture where they literally call firing people keeper test failures. Sounds brutal, right? But here's the reality. Netflix has grown 3,000% under Hastings, while their nicer competitors like Blockbuster, who avoided tough personnel decisions, completely disappeared. I remember reading about Netflix's famous keeper test. Managers regularly asked themselves, if this person gave notice tomorrow, would I fight to keep them or would I accept their resignation with relief? If the answer is the latter, they let the person go immediately. It sounds heartless until you realize that keeping underperformers actually hurts everyone. The high performers get frustrated and leave, customers get worse products, and eventually the whole company suffers. The cultural example that really drove this home was studying Anna Wintour at Vogue. Everyone knows her as Nuclear Wintour because of her supposedly icy demeanor and impossible standards. I used to think she was just mean, but then I learned the deeper story. Wintour has spent decades building a fashion empire that influences global trends and launches careers. Her cruelty is actually precision. She knows exactly what excellence looks like, and she won't accept anything less. I got to see this dynamic firsthand when my sister worked as an intern at a high-end marketing agency in New York. The creative director there, Maria, had a reputation for being impossibly demanding. She'd reject campaigns that everyone else thought were good enough, push teams to redo work that was 90% complete, and wasn't shy about telling people when their ideas weren't working. But you know what happened? That agency consistently won industry awards. Their client retention rate was incredible, and everyone who worked there for more than a year got poached by bigger agencies at significant salary increases. My sister initially complained about Maria's harsh feedback, but by the end of her internship, she was begging to stay. I learned more in 6 months under Maria than I did in 4 years of college, she told me. She pushed me to be better than I ever thought I could be. That's when I understood that what we often call being mean is actually caring enough to demand excellence from people. The contrast became even clearer when I looked at leaders who tried to be nice and failed spectacularly. I studied the case of Terry Semel at Yahoo, who was universally described as a collaborative and gentle CEO. He avoided making hard decisions about underperforming divisions because he didn't want to hurt existing teams. While he was being diplomatic, Google and Facebook were making aggressive, sometimes ruthless moves that transformed the internet landscape. Yahoo went from being worth $125 billion to being sold for less than $5 billion. This pattern showed up everywhere once I started looking for it. Steve Jobs wasn't beloved for his kindness, he was respected for his uncompromising vision. Jeff Bezos didn't build Amazon by being everyone's friend. He built it by maintaining obsessive customer focus, even when it meant making uncomfortable decisions about employees, partners, and entire business units. What struck me most was realizing that these leaders weren't cruel for the sake of being cruel. They were inflexible about standards and principles because they understood something most nice leaders miss. Accepting mediocrity is actually unkind to everyone involved. When you let someone coast in a role they're not suited for, you're hurting their career development, their teammates' morale, and ultimately the customers who depend on excellent products and services. But here's the paradox that took me years to fully grasp. Once these leaders established their reputations for having impossibly high standards, their moments of genuine kindness and recognition had exponentially more impact than constant niceness ever could. When Jobs praised someone's work, it meant everything because it was rare and earned. When Wintour smiled, people remembered it for years because it represented true achievement, not participation trophy culture. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are. Cursor, Niccolò Machiavelli. The story that haunts me most about the dangers of excessive kindness happened right in my own family. My uncle Richard inherited a successful manufacturing business from my grandfather in 2015, a company that had been profitable for 30 years, employed 43 people, and was basically a money printing machine. Richard was the nice son, the one everyone loved at family gatherings because he never caused drama, always listened to everyone's problems, and genuinely wanted to help everybody succeed. Within 3 years, the company was bankrupt. Not struggling, completely dead. 43 families lost their livelihoods, and our family lost a legacy that had taken decades to build. The crazy part? Richard never made a single bad decision. He just couldn't make the necessary hard ones. When the automotive industry shifted and their biggest clients started demanding lower prices, Richard didn't want to lay anyone off, so he accepted contracts. That barely covered costs. When 2 long-time employees became dead weight, he couldn't bear to fire them, so he kept paying their salaries while their departments hemorrhaged money. I watched this unfold in real time, and it reminded me of the historical parallel I'd been studying, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. This guy was known as the gentle Tsar, who wanted to be loved by his people rather than feared. He consistently avoided making the harsh reforms that could have modernized Russia and prevented revolution. When advisors recommended difficult but necessary changes to the feudal system, Nicholas would say things like, "I don't want to burden the people," or "We must find a gentler way." The result? The Russian Revolution of 1917 cost him his empire, his crown, and ultimately the lives of his entire family. His kindness to corrupt nobles and outdated systems destroyed 3 centuries of Romanov rule. If Nicholas had been willing to be cruel to a few hundred aristocrats, millions of Russians might have been spared the horrors of civil war and Stalin's purges. Sometimes trying to avoid small pains creates massive suffering later. The business world equivalent that really opened my eyes was studying Tony Hsieh's final years at Zappos. Everyone knows the early Zappos story: brilliant company culture, happiness as a core value, employees who genuinely loved coming to work. But Hsieh took the niceness philosophy too far with something called holacracy, where hierarchy was eliminated and everyone was supposed to be equals. Conflict was discouraged as negative energy, direct feedback was seen as un-Zappos-like, and accountability became nearly impossible. I actually visited their Las Vegas headquarters in 2018 during a conference, and you could feel the dysfunction. Employees seemed confused about decision-making processes. Projects were taking forever to complete because nobody wanted to step on anyone's toes, and talented people were quietly leaving for companies with clearer structures. Zappos went from being consistently ranked as one of the best places to work to struggling with retention and losing market share to more aggressive competitors. But the example that really shook me was watching Ellen DeGeneres' spectacular fall from grace. For almost 2 decades, she built her entire brand around "Be kind to one another." Every show ended with that tagline. She was America's sweetheart, the friendly neighbor everyone wanted to have coffee with. But when the workplace toxicity scandal broke in 2020, we learned that her obsession with maintaining a kind public image had prevented her from addressing serious management issues behind the scenes. Ellen was so focused on being perceived as nice that she avoided confronting toxic producers, didn't want to rock the boat with difficult personnel decisions, and basically allowed a hostile work environment to flourish while she maintained plausible deniability. Her performative kindness masked management negligence. When the scandal hit, she lost her show, multiple endorsement deals, and a reputation built over decades. The irony was devastating. Her fear of being seen as mean made her complicit in actual meanness. I saw this same pattern play out with a startup founder I knew in Seattle named David Chen. Brilliant guy, Stanford MBA, absolutely beloved by his team. David raised $4 million for a food delivery app and hired 30 people, who all thought he was the coolest boss ever. He never said no to employee requests, avoided giving negative feedback, and genuinely believed that creating a family atmosphere would make everyone naturally perform at their best. The company ran out of money in 18 months. David had been so kind about letting people work flexible hours that productivity plummeted. He was so understanding about missed deadlines that they never shipped a working product. He was so nice about equity requests that he gave away too much of the company to early employees who hadn't actually earned it. His kindness killed more jobs and dreams than any mean CEO ever could have. What really got to me was talking to one of David's former employees, Sarah, about 6 months after the company folded. "I actually loved working there at first," she told me over coffee. "David was so supportive and understanding. But after a while I realized I wasn't growing professionally. He never pushed me to be better, never gave me honest feedback about my weaknesses. I was getting comfortable instead of getting stronger." The data on this is overwhelming. A McKinsey study showed that companies led by highly agreeable CEOs are 40% more likely to fail within 5 years compared to those led by more demanding leaders. Yahoo's market value dropped from 125 billion to 4.6 billion under leadership that prioritized collaboration over decisive action. Kodak, BlackBerry, Sears. All these companies died because their leaders were too nice to kill products and divisions that needed to die. The pattern is always the same. Leaders who can't make enemies end up making victims. They're so afraid of being disliked by a few people that they fail to protect the many people depending on them for jobs, innovation, and results. Their inability to disappoint anyone guarantees they'll devastate everyone eventually. My Uncle Richard taught me the most painful lesson of all. After the company went under, he said something I'll never forget. I thought I was being kind to everyone, but I realize now I was just being selfish. I was more concerned with being liked than with being responsible. He was 58 years old, starting over from nothing, because he couldn't bear to make the hard choices that would have saved 43 jobs and a family legacy. That's when I understood that true kindness sometimes requires being temporarily unkind. A surgeon who refuses to cut isn't compassionate, they're negligent. A parent who never disciplines isn't loving, they're preparing their child for failure. And a leader who won't make difficult decisions isn't nice. They're creating conditions for much greater suffering down the road. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is refuse to be cruel when the situation demands it. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. Niccolo Machiavelli. I first discovered how fast humans assess power dynamics during a job interview in Chicago back in 2017. I was interviewing for a senior position at a consulting firm, and within the first 30 seconds of meeting the hiring manager, Janet, I knew she was evaluating something way beyond my resume. She wasn't just listening to my words, she was reading my posture, analyzing my handshake, measuring how I carried myself into that conference room. What fascinated me was realizing this assessment was happening completely below conscious awareness. Janet later told me that she'd made her initial decision about my leadership potential before I even sat down, based purely on how I entered the room and responded to her greeting. "Your body language told me you belonged here," she explained. "Some candidates walk in like they're asking for permission to exist. Others walk in like they're evaluating whether we're worth their time. Guess which ones we hire?" This led me down a rabbit hole of research into what scientists call thin-slice judgments, our brain's ability to make accurate assessments about competence, trustworthiness, and dominance within milliseconds of meeting someone. Amy Cuddy's research at Harvard showed that people form impressions about your leadership capability in less than 7 seconds, and these snap judgments are surprisingly accurate predictors of actual performance. The breakthrough moment came when I started paying attention to how differently people responded to me, depending on my energy and presence. During my nice guy phase, I noticed that people would interrupt me mid-sentence in meetings, talk over me during presentations, and generally treat my opinions as suggestions rather than decisions. But when I shifted to a more assertive presence, speaking slower, making stronger eye contact, taking up more space, suddenly the same people started asking for my input and deferring to my judgment. The science behind this is fascinating and brutal. Our limbic system, the ancient part of our brain responsible for survival, is constantly scanning for alpha and beta signals. When someone displays what researchers call high-power nonverbals, firm handshake, steady eye contact, controlled speech patterns, it triggers neural pathways that categorize them as competent and trustworthy. But overly accommodating behavior activates completely different circuits that flag someone as non-threatening, which unfortunately gets translated as not leadership material. I tested this theory during a company retreat in Denver. We were doing one of those team-building exercises where small groups had to solve a problem together. I deliberately modulated my behavior between 2 different sessions. In the first group, I was my old nice self, asking lots of questions, building consensus, making sure everyone felt heard. In the second group, I was more directive, stating my opinion clearly, making decisions quickly, moving the group toward solutions rather than endless discussion. The results were striking. In the first group, people were polite, but ultimately ignored most of my suggestions. They seemed to view me as a facilitator rather than a leader. But in the second group, even though I was arguably less collaborative, people naturally started looking to me for direction. They asked what I thought we should do next. They implemented my ideas immediately. Same people, same exercise, but completely different group dynamics based solely on how I showed up. This is where most people get the psychology wrong. They think being nice creates positive associations, but excessive agreeableness actually triggers what psychologists call benevolent sexism. People like you, but they don't respect your capabilities. It's the same reason why studies show that women who smile too much in negotiations get worse outcomes, or why leaders who apologize frequently are perceived as less competent even when they're objectively more qualified. The mirror neuron effect explains why this works so powerfully. When you display confidence and controlled authority, other people's brains literally simulate that same state, making them feel more confident about your abilities. But when you display uncertainty or excessive deference, their mirror neurons fire in ways that make them unconsciously doubt your competence. It's not fair, but it's biology. I learned to recognize the specific signs that my presence was commanding genuine respect rather than just polite attention. When I spoke, there was actually silence, not people just waiting for me to finish so they could talk. When I made suggestions, people took notes instead of nodding politely and then forgetting. Most importantly, people started seeking my opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with my official role or expertise. The breakthrough came during a board meeting where we were discussing a major strategic pivot. Instead of my usual approach of asking thoughtful questions and building consensus, I waited until everyone had spoken, then calmly laid out my analysis and recommendation. I didn't ask for agreement. I simply stated what I believed we should do and why. The room went quiet for about 10 seconds, then the CEO said, "That makes sense. Let's move forward with David's plan." What really shocked me was the feedback I got afterward. Board members who had barely acknowledged me in previous meetings started approaching me for private conversations about other initiatives. My direct reports began escalating more complex decisions to me instead of trying to handle everything themselves. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. I'd crossed some invisible threshold from nice colleague to trusted advisor. But here's the most important part. This wasn't about becoming arrogant or dismissive. It was about understanding that leadership presence is a form of service. When you show up with clarity and confidence, you make it easier for other people to follow and contribute effectively. When you're wishy-washy and overly deferential, you force everyone else to work harder to figure out direction and make decisions. The data backs this up consistently. Studies show that teams with leaders who display appropriate dominance, not aggression but controlled authority, perform 28% better than teams with overly accommodating leaders. Why? Because clear hierarchy actually reduces anxiety and increases psychological safety. People work better when they know who's responsible for final decisions and where they fit in the structure. This understanding completely changed how I approached every professional interaction. Instead of trying to be liked, I focused on being clear. Instead of seeking approval, I sought respect. Instead of avoiding conflict, I embraced the temporary discomfort that comes with making tough calls. And ironically, this shift made people like me more authentically than all my previous efforts to be agreeable ever had. A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study, than war and its rules and discipline, for this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules. Niccolo Machiavelli. The moment I realized I needed to completely overhaul my professional approach came during a team review meeting in March 2019. My developer team had just delivered what could charitably be called a disaster, a client-facing application that crashed during the demo, missing half the requested features, and somehow managed to delete test data. As I sat there listening to my team's elaborate explanations about unexpected technical challenges, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach that meant I was about to make another understanding response. But this time, something clicked. I thought about all those case studies I'd been reading about leaders who saved companies by being willing to have uncomfortable conversations. Instead of my usual, "Hey guys, these things happen. Let's figure out how to improve next time." I took a deep breath and said something that felt foreign coming out of my mouth. "This result is completely unacceptable. We committed to delivering a working product, and what we showed today would embarrass a first-year computer science student." The room went dead silent. You could literally hear the air conditioning humming. My lead developer, Marcus, who I'd been covering for in meetings for months, opened his mouth to launch into another excuse. But I held up my hand. "I'm not interested in explanations right now. I want to know your specific plan to fix this by Friday, and I want to understand how we're going to prevent this from happening again." The shift in energy was immediate and unmistakable. Suddenly everyone was focused on solutions instead of elaborate justifications. That was my first real success with what I now call strategic directness, but it was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, I faced an even bigger test when one of my senior team members, Jessica, decided to challenge my authority during our weekly all-hands meeting. She interrupted my presentation about new project timelines and said, "I think David's being unrealistic about these deadlines. We need to have a more collaborative discussion about what's actually achievable." My old self would have immediately backed down, maybe said something like, "Of course, Jessica, let's definitely get everyone's input." But I could feel the entire room watching to see how I'd handle this public challenge. Instead, I looked directly at Jessica and said, calmly but firmly, "This discussion continues in my office after the meeting. Right now we're reviewing the implementation plan." Then I simply continued with my presentation as if nothing had happened. The psychological effect was immediate. I could see people physically straighten up in their chairs. The rest of the meeting proceeded with zero interruptions, and Jessica actually approached me afterward to apologize for the disruption. "I was testing you," she admitted. "I'm glad you didn't cave." That's when I realized that what I'd perceived as undermining was actually her way of checking whether I was serious about taking leadership responsibility. The real test came a month later when our biggest client, TechFlow Industries, demanded we deliver a complex integration 3 weeks ahead of schedule, or they'd terminate our contract worth $400,000 annually. The old me would have said yes immediately and then worked my team into the ground trying to make it happen. Instead, I scheduled a call with their CTO and laid out exactly what was possible. With current resources, we can deliver quality work in 5 weeks or rushed work in 3 weeks. If you need it in 3 weeks with our quality standards, we'll need additional budget for contractor support. My team was shocked when the client actually agreed to the 5-week timeline. "I can't believe they accepted that," said Tom, our junior developer. "Every other vendor they work with just says yes to everything." But I was learning that clients, like employees, actually respect clear boundaries more than endless accommodation. When you consistently deliver what you promise, people trust your assessments about what's realistic. The breakthrough moment came during salary review season. I had to deliver some difficult feedback to Sarah, a talented designer who'd been struggling with deadlines and communication. Previously, I would have sandwiched criticism between compliments and made everything sound like gentle suggestions. This time I was direct. "Sarah, your design work is excellent, but your project management skills are significantly below what we need for your role. Here's specifically what needs to change in the next 90 days. Instead of getting defensive, Sarah actually thanked me. "Finally, someone's telling me what I actually need to work on instead of just saying I'm doing great," she said. "I've been wondering why I wasn't getting more challenging projects." Within 3 months, her performance had improved dramatically, and she ended up getting promoted to senior designer. Clear expectations, it turned out, were actually a form of respect. I started applying this approach to increasingly complex situations. When our main competitor tried to poach 3 of our key developers with higher salary offers, instead of panicking and making desperate counteroffers, I had direct conversations with each person. If money is your primary motivation right now, you should probably take that offer. But if you want to understand the full career development picture here, let's talk about your 3-year trajectory with us. 2 of the 3 developers stayed, and they later told me that my honest assessment of their options made them trust my judgment about their career development. The 3rd one left, which was actually the right outcome. He was genuinely motivated by short-term salary increases rather than long-term growth, and trying to keep him would have created budget problems for retaining the people who were truly committed to our mission. The most advanced application came during a partnership negotiation with a potential client who had a reputation for being extremely demanding and changing requirements mid-project. Instead of being eager to please, I laid out our terms clearly. We're excited to work with you, but we operate differently than most vendors. Our contracts include specific change request procedures and timeline adjustments. If you need maximum flexibility, we're probably not the right fit. They ended up signing with us specifically because of that conversation. Everyone else was telling us what we wanted to hear, their CEO explained later. You were the only one honest about how partnerships actually work. That project became one of our most profitable and led to 3 additional contracts worth over $1 million total. The key insight I learned was that professional strength isn't about being aggressive or confrontational. It's about being clear, consistent, and willing to enforce boundaries. When you stop trying to please everyone and start focusing on delivering real value, people actually respect you more. They know where they stand, what to expect, and can plan accordingly. But perhaps most importantly, discovered that this approach actually made me a better leader for the people who deserved it. When you're not wasting energy managing underperformers or accommodating unreasonable demands, you have more bandwidth to mentor rising stars, take on strategic challenges, and build something genuinely excellent. The best people want to work with leaders who maintain high standards, not leaders who accept whatever happens and call it team building. Hatred is gained as much by good works as by evil. Niccolo Machiavelli. The most painful lesson about boundaries in personal relationships happened during my friendship with my college roommate, Jake, who moved to Austin in 2018. I was genuinely excited to reconnect with someone I'd shared so many great memories with, but within 6 months, our friendship had become a masterclass in how being too nice can destroy even the strongest bonds. Jake was going through a rough patch after his divorce, and I wanted to be the supportive friend he needed during a difficult time. It started small. Jake would show up 20 minutes late to dinner plans, always with some elaborate story about traffic or work emergencies. My response was always the same. No worries, man, I totally understand. When he'd call at 10 p.m. asking to come over because he was feeling down, I'd say yes, even when I had early meetings the next morning. When he borrowed $200 for emergency car repairs and then posted Instagram photos from expensive restaurants that same week, I convinced myself he must have gotten his finances sorted out. The breaking point came during my birthday party. Jake promised to help me set up, confirmed multiple times that he'd be there at 4 p.m., and then showed up at 8:30, after most of the work was done, and half the guests had already arrived. His excuse this time was that he'd lost track of time, helping another friend move. I smiled, said it was fine, and spent the rest of my own birthday party feeling resentful and taken advantage of. That night, I had a conversation with my girlfriend Emma that changed everything. "David, you're not being kind to Jake," she said. "You're enabling him to be a worse version of himself. Every time you accept his disrespect, you're teaching him that your time doesn't matter. That's not friendship, that's codependency." Her words stung because they were true. My niceness wasn't helping Jake grow or improve, it was giving him permission to stay irresponsible. I decided to try a completely different approach the next time Jake inevitably let me down. 2 weeks later, he texted 30 minutes before our planned lunch, saying he needed to reschedule because his ex-wife wanted to discuss something. Instead of my usual "of course, no problem," I replied, "I understand emergencies happen, but this is becoming a pattern. I'm going to stop making plans with you until you can consistently follow through on commitments." Jake's response was immediate and defensive. "Wow, I didn't realize you were keeping score. I thought friends were supposed to be understanding." But I held firm. Friends are understanding about genuine emergencies. This isn't about keeping score. It's about mutual respect. For 2 weeks, I didn't hear from him at all. Then he called and said something I'll never forget. "You were right. I've been taking advantage of your friendship because I knew you'd always be okay with it." The transformation in our relationship was remarkable. Jake started showing up on time, following through on commitments, and actually became more fun to be around because he wasn't constantly making excuses or dealing with the aftermath of his own irresponsibility. More importantly, I stopped feeling resentful and started genuinely enjoying his company again. Setting boundaries hadn't destroyed our friendship, it had saved it. This experience taught me to recognize the same dynamic in family relationships. My sister Lisa had developed a habit of calling me whenever she had any minor crisis, car trouble, work drama, relationship issues, expecting me to drop everything and provide immediate emotional support. I loved my sister and wanted to help, but these calls were happening 3 or 4 times a week, usually during work hours, and always with an expectation of lengthy conversations. The next time Lisa called during an important client meeting, crying about her roommate conflict, I let it go to voicemail. When I called her back that evening, I said something that felt harsh but necessary. "Lisa, I care about you, but I can't be your primary emotional support system for every daily problem. I'm available for real emergencies, but I need you to handle routine issues on your own first." She was hurt initially, but within a month, she'd started developing better problem-solving skills and actually seemed more confident handling challenges independently. The romantic relationship application required even more finesse. I'd been dating Emma for about 8 months when I noticed she had a habit of making plans with friends and then casually informing me afterward, sometimes cancelling, dates we'd already scheduled. My old pattern would have been to be understanding and accommodating, but I realized this was actually disrespectful to both of us. The next time it happened, instead of saying, "That's fine, we can reschedule," I said, "I need you to check with me before making plans that affect our time together. When you cancel our dates for social events, it makes me feel like I'm not a priority." Emma's initial reaction was defensive. "I didn't think you'd mind." But then she paused and said, "You're right. I wouldn't like it if you did that to me." What surprised me was how much this improved our relationship overall. Emma later told me that she actually respected me more for addressing the issue directly rather than just being passively accommodating. "It showed me that you value our relationship enough to have difficult conversations," she explained. "When guys just accept everything, it makes me wonder if they actually care or if they're just afraid of conflict." The most advanced application came with my parents, who had developed a pattern of making comments about my career choices and lifestyle decisions during family dinners. They meant well, but their suggestions about when I should get married, buy a house or change careers were becoming a source of constant stress. Instead of continuing to deflect with humor or change the subject, I finally addressed it directly. "Mom, Dad, I appreciate that you care about my future, but I need you to trust that I can make my own decisions about my life. I won't be discussing my career plans or relationship timeline at family gatherings anymore." The conversation was uncomfortable, but it worked. They still care about my life, but they express interest in ways that feel supportive rather than judgmental. The key insight I learned was that boundaries in personal relationships aren't about being mean or selfish. They're about creating space for genuine respect and authentic connection. When you accept poor treatment in the name of being nice, you're actually preventing the other person from growing and improving. You're also building resentment that will eventually poison the relationship anyway. People often confuse boundaries with ultimatums, but they're completely different. An ultimatum is, "Do this or else." A boundary is, "I will do this to protect my own well-being." You're not trying to control other people's behavior. You're clarifying what you will and won't accept in your own life. This distinction makes all the difference in how these conversations feel and how effective they are. The most profound change was realizing that the people who truly care about you will actually appreciate clear boundaries because it makes the relationship more honest and sustainable. The people who get angry when you set reasonable limits are usually the ones who are benefiting from the imbalance in the first place. Learning to be okay with disappointing those people was one of the most liberating things I've ever done. Never was anything great achieved without danger. Niccolo Machiavelli. The negotiation that changed my entire understanding of power dynamics happened in a cramped conference room at a software company in Dallas during the summer of 2019. I was sitting across from their CFO, Patricia, discussing a consulting contract that could make or break my fledgling business. For months, I'd been taking whatever clients offered, grateful just to have work. But this time, I decided to apply everything I'd been learning about strategic positioning, even though it scared the hell out of me. Patricia opened with their standard offer. We can do $15,000 for the 3-month project. My old self would have immediately said yes, probably adding something like, "That sounds perfect, when do we start?" Instead, I did something that felt completely unnatural. I stayed silent for about 10 seconds, then pulled out a folder with market research I'd prepared. Based on similar projects and the value this will generate for your company, the investment should be $25,000. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Patricia raised an eyebrow and leaned back in her chair. "That's quite a bit higher than what we budgeted." But instead of backing down or apologizing for my unreasonable request, I walked her through exactly why the higher price reflected the actual value of the work. I showed her case studies of similar projects, explained the potential revenue impact for their company, and most importantly, I demonstrated that I understood my own worth in the marketplace. What happened next surprised both of us. Patricia said, "You know what? Most consultants come in here just happy to get any work. You're the first one who's actually shown me why this project matters strategically." We ended up settling at $22,000, 47% higher than their initial offer. But the real revelation came afterward, when she said, "I'm going to recommend you to 2 other companies in our network. We want to work with people who understand value, not people who compete on price." That experience taught me the fundamental psychology of negotiation. When you demonstrate that you know your own value, other people start believing it too. But when you accept whatever's offered without pushback, you're essentially telling the other party that you don't think you're worth more. It's not about being greedy. It's about establishing that you're a serious professional who understands market dynamics. The lesson became even clearer during my salary negotiation 6 months later, when I was considering a full-time position at a tech startup. The CEO, Michael, offered me $85,000 plus equity. My research showed that similar roles in Austin were paying between $95,000 and $110,000. Instead of accepting immediately because I was grateful for the opportunity, I came prepared with data. "Michael, I'm excited about this role, but based on market rates for someone with my experience in this city, the salary should be in the $95,000 to $100,000 range." I then pulled out printouts from Glassdoor, salary surveys, and specific job postings for comparable positions. Michael's response was immediate. "I appreciate you doing your homework. Let's make it $98,000. The negotiation took less than 5 minutes because I demonstrated that my request was based on objective market reality, not arbitrary demands. But the real breakthrough came when I learned to negotiate beyond just money. During that same conversation, I also addressed the equity package, vacation time, and professional development budget. I'd also like to discuss attending 2 industry conferences annually, with the company covering expenses. Based on my research, this is standard for senior roles and will directly benefit our team's capabilities. Michael agreed to that as well, adding about $4,000 in annual value to the package. The key insight was realizing that most people approach negotiations from a position of weakness because they're afraid of rejection. They think asking for more might cause the other party to withdraw the offer entirely. But in reality, when you negotiate professionally and come prepared with data, people respect your business acumen. They want to work with someone who understands their own value and can advocate for themselves effectively. I started applying this approach to every significant negotiation. When buying my car, instead of accepting the dealer's first price, I researched comparable vehicles, printed out listings from other dealers, and presented a counteroffer based on actual market data. Based on these 3 similar vehicles within 50 miles, the fair price for this car is $23,500. The salesman immediately came down by $1,800. The most advanced application came during a business partnership discussion with a marketing agency. They wanted to collaborate on a large client project, but proposed a revenue split that heavily favored their company. Instead of being grateful for the opportunity to work with a more established firm, I analyzed the actual value each party would contribute and presented an alternative structure. I understand you have the client relationship, but our technical expertise is what makes this project possible. Instead of the 70-30 split you proposed, I think 60-40 better reflects our respective contributions. I backed this up with specific examples of similar partnerships in our industry and data about the specialized skills we were bringing to the table. They agreed to 55-45, which was still a significant improvement from their initial offer. What surprised me most was how these negotiations actually improved my relationships with clients and partners rather than damaging them. When you demonstrate that you understand value, creation and market dynamics, people see you as a strategic partner rather than just a vendor or employee. They start bringing you into bigger decisions and more complex projects because they trust your business judgment. The psychological principle at work is reciprocal respect. When you advocate for yourself professionally, you signal that you'll also advocate effectively for shared projects and mutual interests. But when you consistently undervalue yourself, people unconsciously assume you'll undervalue other important things too. It's not logical, but it's how human psychology works in professional contexts. I learned to recognize the specific language patterns that indicate strength versus weakness in negotiations. Instead of saying, "I was hoping we could discuss," and I started saying, "I'd like to review the compensation structure." Instead of, "Would it be possible to," I began using, "Let's discuss adjusting the timeline to ensure quality." Small linguistic changes that communicate confidence and professionalism rather than uncertainty and neediness. The most important lesson was understanding that negotiation isn't about winning or losing. It's about finding arrangements that work for everyone while ensuring you're not leaving value on the table. When both parties feel the final agreement is fair and well-reasoned, it creates a foundation for long-term successful relationships. But when one party accepts whatever's offered without discussion, it often creates an imbalanced dynamic that causes problems later. The transformation in my professional life was dramatic. Within 18 months of consistently applying these principles, my average project value had increased by 60%, my salary had jumped by 35%, and most importantly, I was working with higher quality clients who respected my expertise. People started referring to me as someone who knows his worth, which opened doors to opportunities I never would have been considered for when I was the grateful to be here guy. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Niccolo Machiavelli. The moment I understood the brutal psychology of social media happened during what I now call the LinkedIn incident of August 2020. I'd posted an article about remote work strategies that somehow attracted a comment from someone who clearly hadn't read it, but felt compelled to lecture me about how out of touch I was with real workers. My instinct was to write a thoughtful 3-paragraph response explaining my actual position, providing additional context, and basically begging this stranger to understand that I was really one of the good guys. But something made me pause before hitting send. I'd been studying how different public figures handle online criticism, and I noticed a fascinating pattern. The people who spent time crafting detailed defensive responses usually ended up in longer, more vicious comment wars. Meanwhile, figures like Elon Musk would either ignore attacks completely or respond with something so brief and confident that it shut down further discussion. Instead of my apologetic essay, I simply replied, "Interesting perspective, thanks for sharing." The result was immediate and educational. The original commenter didn't respond again, and several other people actually liked my restrained reply. More importantly, the conversation moved on instead of spiraling into the kind of digital drama that can hijack an entire thread. That's when I realized that online defensiveness is perceived as weakness, even when you're technically right about whatever you're defending. The real test came 6 months later, when a former client posted a negative review about our company on Google, claiming we'd delivered subpar work and missed deadlines. The review was factually incorrect. We'd actually delivered early, and the client had signed off on everything before posting this review. My first impulse was to write a detailed rebuttal explaining exactly what had happened. including screenshots of their approval emails and timeline documentation. Instead, I crafted a single professional response. We strive for excellence in every project. Clients who've worked with us can share their experiences as well. I didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't provide a counter-narrative, just acknowledged their opinion and subtly invited others to weigh in. Within 2 weeks, 3 other clients had posted positive reviews that basically made the negative one irrelevant. Fighting the criticism would have drawn more attention to it and made me look desperate for vindication. The most advanced application came during what could have been a career-damaging situation. Someone had posted false information about a project I'd worked on, claiming I'd taken credit for work that wasn't mine. The post was getting shared in professional circles, and I could feel my reputation being damaged in real time. Every instinct screamed to immediately publish a detailed correction, with evidence, testimonials, and a complete timeline of events. But I'd learned enough about digital psychology to recognize this as a trap. Engaging in public disputes about professional credibility almost always makes both parties look unprofessional, regardless of who's right. Instead, I reached out privately to the 3 or 4 people whose opinions actually mattered in my industry. I shared the accurate information with them directly, along with documentation, and asked them to keep me informed if they heard this narrative spreading in contexts where it might affect real opportunities. The false narrative died within a week, without me ever responding publicly. One of the industry leaders I'd contacted actually posted something positive about our recent work that indirectly contradicted the false claims. Another mentioned me positively in a podcast that reached more people than the original negative post ever had. By taking the high road publicly while managing the situation strategically behind the scenes, I ended up with a stronger reputation than before the incident. This taught me the fundamental rule of digital reputation management. Your response to criticism is often more important than the criticism itself. People are watching to see how you handle pressure, how you react to conflict, and whether you maintain your composure when attacked. When you respond with long defensive explanations, you're essentially saying that random people's opinions have power over your emotional state. I started studying how different types of leaders handle social media criticism. Tech CEOs like Jeff Bezos rarely respond to individual complaints or criticisms at all. When they do engage, it's brief, professional, and focused on moving forward rather than relitigating the past. Political figures who survive social media storms are usually the ones who either ignore attacks completely or respond with such confidence that they reframe the entire conversation. The pattern became clear during the 2020 election cycle when I watched how different candidates handled online criticism. The ones who spent time arguing with individual Twitter users or trying to fact-check every false claim looked weak and defensive. The ones who stayed focused on their own message and ignored the noise maintained their authority and actually gained followers even among people who disagreed with their politics. This principle extends beyond handling criticism to general social media strategy. I learned that people follow accounts that make them feel something, inspired, informed, entertained, or challenged. They unfollow accounts that make them feel uncomfortable, confused, or sorry for the person posting. When you constantly seek validation through posts asking for opinions or sharing personal struggles, you're training your audience to see you as someone who needs help rather than someone who provides value. The most counterintuitive lesson was about sharing professional setbacks online. My initial instinct was to be authentic and vulnerable by sharing challenges and asking for support from my network. But I noticed that while people would like these posts and leave encouraging comments, they were less likely to refer business opportunities or recommend me for speaking engagements afterward. Vulnerability can build personal connections, but it can also undermine professional credibility if not handled carefully. I developed what I call the 90-10 rule for professional social media. 90% of my posts should provide value to others, insights, useful information, interesting perspectives, and only 10% should be about my own needs or challenges. When I do share something personal or ask for help, it carries more weight because it's rare and therefore feels genuine rather than performative. The breakthrough moment came when I realized that social media presence is essentially a form of ongoing negotiation with your professional reputation. Every post, comment, and response is either building your credibility or eroding it. People are constantly making micro-assessments about your judgment, professionalism, and emotional stability based on your digital behavior. Understanding this dynamic completely changed how I approached online interactions. The most advanced application involves knowing when to use social media strategically rather than just reactively. When launching new projects or building relationships with potential clients, I started crafting content that demonstrates expertise while subtly addressing common objections or concerns. Instead of directly pitching services, I'd share insights that showcase the quality of thinking people could expect from working with me. The transformation was remarkable. Within a year of applying these principles consistently, my LinkedIn connections included significantly more senior-level professionals. I was getting invited to speak at industry events, and potential clients were reaching out to me instead of me having to chase leads. Most importantly, I'd learned to see social media as a tool for building long-term professional equity rather than seeking short-term emotional validation. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, but above all, avoid being despised. Niccolo Machiavelli. The moment I truly understood the difference between authentic strength and performative toughness came during a crisis at our company in November 2021. Our lead developer, Marcus, had been diagnosed with a serious health condition that would require him to take medical leave right in the middle of our biggest product launch. The old me would have immediately said, "Don't worry about anything, we'll handle everything, just focus on getting better." The new me might have been tempted to show my strategic thinking by immediately discussing backup plans and timeline adjustments. Instead, I found myself in uncharted territory, applying firmness and compassion simultaneously. I sat down with Marcus privately and said, "Your health is the absolute priority here, and your job will be waiting when you're ready to return. At the same time, I need to understand the current state of your projects so we can ensure nothing falls through the cracks while you're gone." I was direct about business needs while being genuinely supportive about his personal situation. What struck me was Marcus's reaction. "Thank you for treating me like an adult," he said. "I was worried you'd either pretend this wasn't going to affect the project or that you'd panic about the timeline. This feels like you actually care about both me and the team." That conversation taught me that authentic leadership means being honest about realities while remaining genuinely committed to people's well-being. The real test came when I had to communicate this situation to our client, a demanding startup CEO named Jennifer, who had zero tolerance for delays or complications. My instinct was to either downplay the situation or over-apologize for the disruption. Instead, I called her directly and said, "We have a team member facing a serious health issue who needs to take medical leave. Here's our specific plan to maintain project momentum, and here's the one area where we might see a 2-week delay." Jennifer's response surprised me. "I appreciate you being upfront about this instead of just missing deadlines and explaining later. The fact that you already have a plan tells me you're thinking ahead." We ended up not only maintaining the relationship, but strengthening it because I demonstrated that we could handle adversity professionally and transparently. This experience made me realize that most people confuse authentic leadership with either being nice all the time or being tough all the time. But real leaders integrate both qualities strategically. They're inflexible about standards and outcomes, while being flexible about methods and individual circumstances. They demand excellence while recognizing that people are human beings with complex lives and genuine challenges. I started studying leaders who had mastered this integration, and Satya Nadella at Microsoft became my primary case study. When Nadella took over Microsoft in 2014, the company was struggling with internal competition and a culture of blame. His response wasn't to be either purely collaborative or purely authoritative. Instead, he was ruthlessly clear about performance expectations while being genuinely curious about people's ideas and challenges. Nadella implemented what he called a learn-it-all culture to replace Microsoft's know-it-all culture. But this wasn't just feel-good corporate speak. He backed it up with concrete changes to promotion criteria, performance reviews, and strategic priorities. People who embraced continuous learning and collaboration were rewarded. Those who clung to political maneuvering and blame shifting were moved out. Compassionate in approach, inflexible about results. I began applying this principle in my own leadership style through what I called standards with stories. When someone on my team was struggling with performance, instead of just delivering criticism or just being understanding, I'd combine both. Sarah, your project management skills need significant improvement. That's non-negotiable for your role. Let's talk about what specific support and training would help you get there. And let's set some measurable milestones. For the next 90 days, the transformation was remarkable. People started responding more positively to feedback because they knew it came from a genuine desire to help them succeed, not from arbitrary authority or personal irritation. They also took the feedback more seriously because they understood that improvement was expected, not optional. The combination of high standards and genuine support created psychological safety that actually enhanced performance. This approach proved especially powerful during our annual review process. Instead of the traditional sandwich method of feedback, compliment, criticism, compliment, I started having what I called growth conversations. I'd begin by acknowledging specific contributions and strengths, then clearly identify areas needing development, then collaborate on specific plans for improvement. The key was being direct about gaps while remaining genuinely invested in the person's success. The breakthrough came when I had to address a situation with two team members who had been feuding over project responsibilities. Traditional approaches might suggest either mandating collaboration through team-building exercises or simply reassigning them to different projects. Instead, I called them both into my office and said, "Your personal conflict is affecting team morale and project quality. I don't need you to be friends, but I need you to be professional. Here's exactly what that looks like in practice." I then outlined specific behavioral expectations, how they would communicate in meetings, how they would handle disagreements, and what escalation process they would follow if they couldn't resolve issues directly. I was clear that continued unprofessional behavior would result in performance improvement plans, but I also offered to facilitate a conversation about underlying issues if they wanted to address the root cause. Both team members later told me that conversation was more effective than months of HR-mediated conflict resolution sessions. "You treated us like adults who could solve problems instead of children who needed constant supervision," one of them explained. "But you also made it clear that solving it wasn't optional." The combination of respect for their autonomy and clarity about expectations created the structure they needed to work through their issues. The most advanced application came during our company's strategic pivot in 2022. We needed to fundamentally change our service offerings, which meant some people's roles would change significantly and others might not fit with our new direction. The traditional approach would be either to sugarcoat the changes to avoid anxiety or to be coldly businesslike about the transition. Instead, I held an all-hands meeting where I was completely transparent about the challenges we were facing, the strategic changes we were making, and the potential impact on individual roles. But I combined this honesty with genuine commitment to helping everyone navigate the transition successfully. These changes are happening regardless of how comfortable we are with them. Our choice is whether we manage this transition professionally or let it manage us. I then outlined specific timelines for role clarification, skills development opportunities for people who wanted to adapt to new requirements, and generous transition support for those who decided the new direction wasn't right for them. By being honest about business realities while remaining genuinely committed to people's success, we managed a potentially devastating transition with minimal turnover and actually higher team morale than before. The key insight was realizing that authentic leadership isn't about choosing between being tough or being kind. It's about being both simultaneously in service of something larger than yourself. When your standards come from genuine care for excellence and people's growth rather than ego or power, others can feel the difference. When your compassion is backed up by real action and clear expectations rather than just nice words, it creates trust and respect that purely nice leaders never achieve. People don't follow leaders because they're likable or because they're intimidating. They follow leaders who they believe will help them succeed, who will make tough decisions when necessary, and who genuinely care about outcomes that matter. That combination of strength and humanity isn't a balance you strike. It's an integration you embody when your leadership serves purposes beyond your own comfort and approval. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Niccolo Machiavelli. The wake-up call that made me realize I'd completely lost my edge came during a team meeting in September 2020. I was presenting our quarterly results when Jake, one of my junior developers, interrupted me mid-sentence to suggest we circle back on those metrics after we've had time to digest them. Not only did he interrupt me, but 3 other people immediately started side conversations as if my presentation had just ended. I stood there for about 10 seconds, unsure whether to continue, and finally just said, okay, I guess we can discuss this later. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that moment and asking myself, when exactly had I become the kind of leader whose own team felt comfortable dismissing in the middle of a presentation? 6 months earlier, people hung on every word during my updates. Now they were treating my meetings like casual brainstorming sessions where everyone's input carried equal weight, regardless of role or expertise. The pattern became impossible to ignore once I started paying attention. When I'd schedule one-on-ones with team members, they'd reschedule at the last minute with casual texts like, "Something came up, can we do Thursday instead?" When I'd assign projects with specific deadlines, people would send me updates 3 days late, as if punctuality was optional. Most telling of all, when disagreements arose in meetings, people would argue with my decisions as if I was just another voice in the room rather than the person ultimately responsible for results. I realized I was exhibiting every classic symptom of a leader who'd become too accommodating. I was asking permission instead of giving direction. Do you think we should maybe consider possibly adjusting our approach? I was over-explaining every decision as if I needed to justify my authority to my own team. Most damaging of all, I was avoiding difficult conversations until small problems became major crises. The moment of truth came when I discovered that my top performer, Sarah, had been actively looking for other jobs. During her exit interview with HR, she said something that haunted me. "David's a really nice guy, but I don't feel like I'm learning anything or being challenged to grow. It feels like he's more concerned with everyone being comfortable than with anyone being excellent." She was leaving because my leadership style wasn't pushing her to reach her potential. I started researching the specific warning signs that indicate when niceness has crossed into ineffectiveness, and the data was sobering. Teams with overly agreeable leaders showed 28% higher turnover among top performers, specifically because ambitious people want to work for leaders who will challenge them and help them grow. Meanwhile, underperformers stay longer because they know their mediocrity won't be addressed directly. The psychological research revealed why this happens. When leaders consistently avoid conflict and difficult conversations, they create what psychologists call learned helplessness in their teams. People stop taking initiative because they've learned that unclear direction and inconsistent follow-through are the norm. High performers become frustrated because they crave clear feedback and growth opportunities, while low performers become complacent because they face no real consequences. I conducted what I now call the respect audit, a brutally honest assessment of how people actually responded to my leadership. Did people follow through on commitments without multiple reminders? When I spoke in meetings, did conversations stop or continue? Were team members proactively bringing me solutions or just problems? Did people seem to value my opinion on decisions outside my direct authority? The results were humbling. I realized that somewhere in my journey to become a better leader, I'd swung too far in the direction of accommodation. I was so afraid of being the demanding boss I'd once resented that I'd become the pushover boss that nobody respected. My team liked me personally, but they didn't trust my professional judgment or look to me for guidance on important decisions. The recovery process required completely restructuring how I showed up professionally. I started with small changes, speaking more slowly and deliberately in meetings, making eye contact when giving instructions, using definitive language, instead of tentative suggestions. Instead of saying, "I think maybe we should consider," I began saying, "We're going to implement this approach." Instead of, "What do you guys think?" I started asking, "What questions do you have about this plan?" The shift in team dynamics was immediate and sometimes uncomfortable. During my first new team meeting, when I laid out project assignments without asking for extensive input, you could feel the surprise in the room. Tom, who had gotten used to debating every decision, started to push back on a timeline, and I simply said, "I understand your concern, but this is the schedule we're working with. Let's discuss what support you need to meet it." The real test came when I had to address Jason, a developer who'd been consistently missing deadlines while always having elaborate explanations for why projects were more complex than anticipated. Previously, I would have had multiple check-in conversations, offering additional resources and extending deadlines. This time I was direct. "Jason, you've missed your last 3 deadlines. This pattern needs to change immediately. What's your specific plan to ensure the next deliverable is on time?" Jason's response revealed everything about how far my authority had eroded. He actually seemed surprised that I was being direct about performance issues. "I didn't realize you were tracking it that closely," he said. That comment made me realize that my team had gotten so used to my understanding approach that they'd stopped viewing deadlines as real commitments. My niceness had accidentally taught them that accountability was optional. The transformation took about 4 months of consistent recalibration. I had to have several uncomfortable conversations with team members who had grown accustomed to the previous dynamic. Some people initially resisted the change, viewing my new directness as sudden personality shift rather than a return to appropriate professional standards. But gradually something remarkable happened. Team performance improved dramatically, and ironically, morale got better rather than worse. The breakthrough moment came when Sarah, who had been planning to leave, approached me privately and said, "I don't know what changed, but I'm actually excited about work again. I feel like you're pushing us to be better, instead of just managing us to be comfortable." 3 months later, she decided to stay with the company and took on additional leadership responsibilities. The lesson was clear. People don't want leaders who are their friends. They want leaders who help them succeed and grow. When you're too nice to give honest feedback, set clear expectations, or hold people accountable, you're actually being unkind to everyone involved. You're denying high performers the growth they crave, enabling low performers to stay stuck in mediocrity, and failing in your fundamental responsibility to drive results that benefit the entire organization. The most important insight was understanding that respect and affection operate on different timelines. People might initially prefer the nice leader who doesn't challenge them or create any discomfort. But over time, they lose respect for leaders who don't help them achieve excellence. Conversely, they might initially resist a leader who sets high standards and demands accountability, but they ultimately develop deep respect for leaders who care, enough to push them toward their potential. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are, and those few will not dare to oppose themselves to the opinion of the many who have the majesty of the state to defend them. Niccolo Machiavelli. The moment I understood the true power of strategic leadership integration happened during the most challenging period of my career, March 2022, when our company faced what could have been a catastrophic client crisis. Our biggest account, representing 40% of our revenue, was threatening to terminate their contract due to a security breach that wasn't even our fault, but had occurred in a third-party system we'd recommended. I was standing in our conference room at 7 a.m., looking at my team of 12 people who were all waiting to see how I'd handle a situation that could literally end our business. My first instinct was to gather everyone around and say something like, "We're all in this together, let's brainstorm solutions." My second instinct was to take complete control and start barking orders about damage control. But something deeper kicked in, a synthesis of everything I'd learned about leadership over the previous 3 years. I realized this moment required both absolute clarity about our situation and genuine care for the people who'd have to execute our response. Here's the reality, I told the team. TechFlow Industries is considering terminating our contract because of yesterday's security incident. If that happens, we'll need to lay off at least 6 people within 30 days. I paused to let that sink in, watching their faces process the gravity of our situation. But I believe we can save this relationship and come out stronger. Here's exactly what we're going to do and why I think it will work. What happened next was unlike any crisis response I'd ever experienced. Instead of panic or blame shifting, my team immediately focused on solutions. Sarah volunteered to work through the weekend on the security audit. Marcus offered to personally call the client's technical team to explain our remediation plan. Tom started researching similar incidents at other companies to identify best practices we could implement immediately. The key was that I'd been completely honest about consequences, while expressing genuine confidence in our ability to overcome them. I wasn't sugarcoating the situation to protect people's feelings, but I also wasn't creating panic by focusing only on potential failure. This combination of realism and optimism, backed by specific action plans, created what I now recognize as the psychological safety that high-performing teams need during crisis situations. Over the next 72 hours, I applied what I call the 80-20 integration formula. 80% firmness about standards and execution, 20% flexibility about methods and individual circumstances. When team members proposed solutions, I was clear about which ones met our quality standards and which didn't. When someone needed to adjust their schedule to handle personal obligations, I accommodated that while being inflexible about deliverable deadlines. The client meeting that Friday was the ultimate test of this approach. Instead of being defensive about the security incident or overly apologetic about the disruption, I walked into that room with a comprehensive response plan and absolute confidence in our team's capabilities. This incident revealed vulnerabilities in our systems that needed to be addressed anyway, I told TechFlow's CEO. Here's what we've implemented to ensure this never happens again, and here's the additional value these improvements will provide to your operations. What struck me was how differently this conversation felt compared to previous crisis meetings I'd handled. When you lead from a place of integrated strength, honest about problems, confident about solutions, genuinely committed to excellence, other people feel that energy and respond accordingly. TechFlow not only renewed our contract, but actually expanded it by 30% because they were impressed with how professionally we'd handled the crisis. But the real revelation came in the weeks following that crisis. My team's performance reached levels I'd never seen before. People were taking more initiative, communicating more proactively, and holding each other accountable without my intervention. That's when I realized that authentic leadership isn't about choosing between being tough or being kind. It's about being both simultaneously in service of shared success. I started studying leaders who had mastered this integration, and one name kept coming up: Vince Lombardi, the legendary Green Bay Packers coach. Lombardi was famous for his incredibly demanding standards. He'd make players run plays over and over until they were perfect, regardless of weather conditions or fatigue. But his players loved him because they knew his demands came from genuine care for their success, not ego or power trips. Ray Nitschke, one of Lombardi's players, once said something that captured this perfectly. He was tough on us because he cared about us. You always knew that everything he demanded was about making us champions, not making himself look good. That's the difference between authentic strength and performative toughness. Authentic strength serves something larger than the leader's own ego. I began applying this principle systematically across every aspect of my leadership. During performance reviews, I'd start by acknowledging specific contributions and growth, then clearly identify areas needing development, then collaborate on concrete improvement plans. The message was always, I believe in your potential, which is why I'm not accepting your current limitations. This combination of high expectations and genuine support created breakthrough performance improvements. The most advanced application came during our strategic planning process for 2023. Instead of either dictating our direction or trying to build consensus through endless discussion, I presented our market analysis and strategic options, then said, something that felt risky, but proved powerful. Based on this data, I believe we should focus on enterprise clients and phase out small business services. I want your honest input about execution challenges, but the fundamental direction isn't negotiable. This approach accelerated our planning process dramatically while ensuring everyone felt heard on implementation details. People appreciated being trusted with honest business analysis rather than being managed through artificial team-building exercises. They also respected that I was willing to make difficult strategic decisions rather than trying to find solutions that made everyone comfortable. The transformation in our company culture was remarkable. We went from being known as a nice company that delivered decent work to being recognized as a high-performance organization that clients specifically sought out for complex projects. Our employee satisfaction scores actually increased as standards became clearer and more demanding, because people felt they were part of something excellent rather than just acceptable. The breakthrough insight was understanding that true leadership strength isn't about intimidation or control. It's about creating conditions where other people can perform at their highest levels. When your firmness serves their growth and your flexibility serves shared success, people don't experience your leadership as threatening. They experience it as empowering. This synthesis completely changed how I viewed every leadership interaction. Instead of asking, how can I be nice or how can I be tough, I started asking, how can I be most helpful to this person's growth and our shared objectives? Sometimes that meant giving difficult feedback. Sometimes it meant providing emotional support. Sometimes it meant making unpopular decisions. But always, it meant serving something larger than my own comfort or approval. The most profound realization was that people don't follow leaders because they're likable or because they're intimidating. They follow leaders who they believe will help them achieve things they couldn't accomplish alone. When you integrate strength and humanity in service of shared excellence, you create the kind of leadership that people remember decades later, not because you were nice to them, but because you helped them become better than they thought they could be. That's the ultimate Machiavellian insight for modern leaders. Power isn't about being feared or loved. It's about being trusted to make decisions that serve the greater good, even when those decisions are temporarily uncomfortable. When people know that your strength serves their success and your compassion drives real results, you don't have to choose between respect and affection. You earn both because you've proven that your leadership creates value for everyone involved. The world doesn't need more nice leaders who avoid difficult decisions. It needs complete leaders who integrate force and humanity in service of excellence. Because in the end, the greatest kindness you can show people is helping them achieve their potential, even when that requires being temporarily unkind to their comfort zones.